We're about to get underway with panel 2, entitled From Reactive to Proactive, the United States and Information Warfare. This panel's experts will debate the nuances of information warfare in and against the United States. What tactics are the U.S. adversaries deploying? How is the U.S. defending and protecting itself? And how does that actually work in a free and open society with information transparency? So as our panelists take their seats, I will hand the mic over to our moderator, Kevin Lentz, who's a dual master's student here at University of Texas. One thing I do want to say is that most of this is on the record. If there is something, I should have said this earlier, if there's anything that our panelists want to be off the record, please do say so. Otherwise, we will assume it's all on the record and postable. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for that. Here we are. Welcome to the Information Warfare in the U.S. from Reactive to Proactive panel. So last year's conference, we fleshed out a lot of the issues in the U.S. government's efforts in the information environment, and we'll certainly do some of that today. But my hope with this panel is that we can, A, take a step back, re-engage the problem with some renewed energy, and then B, also move a bit beyond describing the problem and get towards sort of prescribing solutions, getting to the blue sky thinking. We're at a policy school here, we're at a huge university. I'm hoping we can generate some fresh ideas that some of us can take as we embark on our careers, maybe in government, intelligence, so forth. So how does the U.S. do information warfare? How can we do it better? Why should we want to do it better? What are the stakes? And then at the center of this panel is kind of the question, what does a proactive information function look like in the U.S.? Because we often learn, a more ideal version of the DoD, IC, et cetera, especially in policy school, but not so much the information side of things. It's kind of a mystery to us. So I'm Kevin Lentz, a master's student here, was already introduced, but I lead the Cyber Pacific project at the Global Disinformation Lab. And that's a joint project with the Army Cyber Institute. And we look at what the Indo-Pacific militaries are doing in cyberspace, how they're thinking about it, organizing it, and how it's different from how we do it. And if that sounds interesting, we're going to have a poster at the reception tonight, so please stop by. And I want to thank Michelle and Sally for giving me the opportunity to moderate this panel. We have some fantastic experts with us today, and I'll keep these bios short. So Matt Armstrong is a man who was sanctioned by Russia in 2022. He's writing a book on the history of information and political warfare in the U.S. as a PhD candidate at the King's College in London. And he has decades of experience in the U.S. government across multiple continents and served as a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed governor of the Board of Broadcasting Governors, which is now the United States Agency for Global Media. And I would recommend a Substack, Mountain Runner, .substack. He responds to the comments, which is nice. Down at the end there, we have Adam Sikes. He spent the first 10 years of his professional career in the U.S. United States Marine Corps, where he was decorated with the Silver Star, among other honors. He then served as a paramilitary officer in the CIA for over a decade. We operate in multiple continents, and his views are his own and do not represent those of his current private sector employer or past government employers. And then lastly, we have Jeff Trimble here. He's a lecturer at The Ohio State University and chairman of the board at EurasiaNet. He worked his way up from a local journalist in Kansas to a Moscow correspondent, then worked at Radio Free Europe, including as acting president, before working as one of the top civil servants at the Broadcasting Board of Governors, coordinating with interagency peers. So these are three folks with storied careers that span multiple decades and continents. I encourage you to read their full bios in the program, and we're very lucky to have them. All right, so we'll have 10 minutes each for opening remarks, and we'll do some moderated questions, and then audience Q&A at the end, and we'll go with Matt, Adam, and then Jeff. So Matt, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. That panel, thank you for having this presentation, this whole conference. This has been wonderful so far. That first panel was just absolutely terrific. And I'm honored to be on this panel with these guys. Well, with your bio, Adam, I didn't know you before, but I've known Jeff for, let's just say, a long time. It's been a long time. So appreciate this. I'm going to try to be under 10 minutes because I believe the Q&A is more valuable because I can tell you what I think you want to know, but I would love to know what you want to know. First, and after I said that about the conference, I'm going to take issue. Most of what we're talking about, I would argue, is not information warfare, it's political warfare. It's the use of the information for an end. I think disinformation is a great term, and information warfare has its utility, but that draws us on to focusing on ammunition rather than the intent, the effect, why something is being done, and for what purpose. So I think with that understanding, we can see that there is just, and with the panel that came before us, a key problem is the absolute stunning lack of leadership. The absence of leadership from the very top on down, because there must be a push signal, a demand signal, both coming from the White House, through the cabinet secretaries, on through the agencies, all the way through, to prioritize, to enable, to support, and to pressure, and to hold account these operations to integrate the informational element in policy, whether that is the domestic side or the foreign side, or establishing domestic activities like the DHS entity Nina was a part of, or the purpose of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, now the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Jeff and I have experience of just the gross misunderstanding and lack of understanding of even within government of what the BBG did, that it even existed. Half of the members of Congress in our oversight when I was a member of the board that I would meet with were surprised the agency existed and wanted to know, what does the VOA do, the Voice of America do? This is leadership. This is, again, White House on down. This is not a party thing. This is a bipartisan failure over decades and decades. So I've got two little quotes I'm going to throw out. Oh, wait, before I go into the leadership part, I want to stick on, this is really interesting in the utility of this and being at a policy school, because part of the dysfunction here is that this political warfare, disinformation, the informational role of policy is absent from the educational pipeline. So when people going through their education, whether bachelor's, master's, PhD, and they go into government service, whether in the legislature or the executive, the understanding of the informational element of policy is just absent. It's just something you sort of learn on the job later on. And it's the sideshow. It is the pixie dust that's sprinkled on the problem later. It's the putting lipstick on a pig. It's to change the subject. It's something that comes later. It's not brought up in front. So one quote that I have is, why should a leader who was so keenly aware of the political and ideological significance of the war have felt that the way to win it was to ignore its political and ideological aspects? I think that's applicable today, and that leader is at any level. But the lower level leaders need the support from above. And another quote is, we have lost and lost in the Cold War for one primary reason. We have been amateurs fighting against professionals. So long as we remain amateurs in the critical field of political warfare, the billions of dollars we annually spend on defense and foreign aid will provide us with a diminishing measure of protection. And one way to realize this is just in the foreign policy realm, national security realm. An errant munition is easily explained if the boom is literal. But if that boom, if that errant munition is a message, people shy away from it. They proactively retreat. We fear engaging on the informational side because we don't have the support from our leadership. So again, I'm just going to keep mine well under 10, I think. I didn't pay attention to the clock, which is right there. So I'm going to pass on. Jeff, thanks. Or Adam.
Thank you. Now I'm on. Hello, everyone, and thank you, for being invited here. This is wonderful. As Kevin said, I spent the first 10 years of my life in the Marine Corps and the next 15 with the Central Intelligence Agency as a paramilitary officer doing covert action. And I believe I was invited on this panel to kind of provide that perspective of the intelligence community, and no longer with the government at all. I now think about this when it comes to writing fiction. And it just so happens that my next novel that comes out next month pertains to exactly this: disinformation, big data, and how it's used and manipulated. But as we're going to talk about things here on the panel here, what I wanted to do was provide a baseline when it comes specifically to the Central Intelligence Agency and covert action. Everything I'm about to discuss has been cleared by the Publications Review Board at the agency, and there's also an exceptional book out there called Executive Secrets, which describes the covert action process and where it comes from in law and title and all those areas. And it's written by William Doherty. But the CIA has essentially three primary missions. That's to collect information, That's to analyze that information and provide it to policymakers to make decisions. And the third one is to perform covert action. And that's where information warfare or covert influence would fall in this discussion right here. Covert action for the U.S. government is enshrined in Title 50 of the U.S. Code, and it has a very specific definition. And it's actions by the U.S. government taken abroad in either a political, military, or diplomatic context where the role of the U.S. government is not acknowledged or it's hidden. So as we think about information for the rest of what we're going to discuss here, that's what I want to kind of throw out there for everybody. And that's it. I think I'm well beyond 10 minutes. Yeah.
Jacob, if you're around, I've got 2 PowerPoint slides I'd like to have ready as background. I want to be careful about using them because I believe that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'll keep it brief, but just because the world of U.S. international broadcasting is a little complicated, it might help. I just wanted to level set for a second on this idea of the American commitment to information warfare, and we can talk about whether that's the best thing to call it or not. But let me just poll the group. What would you guess is the percentage of the international affairs budget of the United States devoted to public diplomacy? And by that, I mean everything the State Department does and what U.S. international broadcasting does. What percentage of the international affairs budget goes to that? Anybody have a guess? Come on, don't be shy, shout it out. Go ahead.
3%.
That's pretty close. Yeah, it's pretty close. So this is what we've got. The percentage of the international affairs budget that goes to public diplomacy in FY22 was 4.14%. And the percentage of total federal discretionary spending, so the federal budget over which Congress has control to say we're going to spend this much, public diplomacy gets 0.14% of that, of the federal budget, less than 1/6 of 1%. So that's the U.S. government commitment on the open side of State Department and U.S. international broadcasting to public diplomacy. And I'm quoting this from the Advisory Commission for Public Diplomacy, which Matt served as executive director for and which does an annual report on this stuff. So just to level set where we are on this. You know, when I saw the name of this panel, I got to say I kind of groaned. I went into journalism during the Watergate era, committed to the notion that journalism is about comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. And I still pretty much believe that about journalism, and that hardly seems consistent with winding up on a panel eventually about information warfare in support of U.S. national security interests. So what I'd like to convince you in a couple of minutes about is that it's not an oxymoron to do independent, hard-hitting, fact-based journalism at taxpayer expense, funded by Congress and under the umbrella of a U.S. government agency. It can be done, and it gets done every day, I think, very successfully. So to debunk, or perhaps for some of you to pre-bunk, to use the language of the day, myths around U.S. international broadcasting, what it is and what it isn't. And I've kind of done it all in U.S. international broadcasting over 20 years, from the editorial side, including managing all the editorial operations at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, 28 languages, to countries in the former Soviet space and Middle East and South Asia, over to the other side of what we refer to as the firewall, serving in the agency itself, including as executive director and eventually as deputy director of the agency, which is the top civil service position in the organization. So I kind of see it all the way across. Before I talk briefly about what U.S. international media does, let me be crystal clear about what it doesn't do. It does not do disinformation. Full stop. Under the accepted definition that disinformation is deliberately spreading false or misleading information. Doesn't do that. If the U.S. government feels that needs to be done, it needs to be done elsewhere. Doesn't get done by the broadcasters. It also does not target audiences in the United States intentionally, although audiences in the United States are welcome to access it. Particularly, it's very easy to do in the digital era today, and Matt's a big expert in the history of that particular case of why it doesn't target U.S. audiences. The slide that's up right now cuts right to the chase about giving the mission of U.S. international broadcasting to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy, and then jumping right ahead to how that connects in promoting the national security interests. This is a quote from the current U.S. Agency for Global Media Strategy, which has been updated just this month. The strategy is called Truth Over Disinformation, Supporting Freedom and Democracy, and it draws directly, as does the work of all agencies involved in national security in the United States, from guidance from the President, usually in the form of the National Security Strategy. Right now, the U.S. has, the administration has an interim strategy, which calls for national security involving promoting freedom, prosperity, peace, and dignity. So that's the connection across from the mission directly to how it cashes out in connection with national security policy. So U.S. AGM itself, and we could jump on, can you jump to the next slide, or do you want me to do it? Oh my God. Let's see. Yeah. Just so you can see this kind of messy diagram which gives the components of U.S. international broadcasting. The agency itself provides the distribution of content, technical and administrative support. It's the administrative and marketing arm of the agency. It oversees the work of 6 entities. 2 of them are federal organizations, the Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which oversees radio and TV Marti, and 4 private nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where I worked for 10 years, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcast Networks, and the Open Technology Fund, which is about promoting freedom in the digital space, and they receive grants from the agency. Also, and this is particularly important, the agency itself serves as the interface with the rest of the U.S. government to ensure that the work of U.S. international media meets the expectation of supporting U.S. national security interests. It's one of the largest media organizations in the world. Nothing in the United States itself comes anywhere close to it. 62 languages, 100 countries, audience of 420 million adults weekly. That's measured audiences where they can actually measure audience, and that excludes any audiences that there might be in the U.S., and those audiences have doubled in the last 10 years. So again, the American taxpayers don't shell out $900 million a year just because it's a good idea to do good journalism around the world. From the very beginning of U.S. international broadcasting, its core mandate has been to tell the truth, and in doing so to say bigger things about our society and our values. In fact, the very first words ever spoken on the Voice of America in 1942 in German, just after the playing of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was a voice saying, "We bring you voices from America. Today and daily from now on, we shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good for us, the news may be bad, but we shall tell you the truth." And this principle is enshrined in a series of documents, most recently and definitively in the 1994 International Broadcasting Act, which very specifically says that it's the policy of the United States to promote the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including the Article 19 stuff, to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. Second, open communication of information and ideas among the peoples of the world contributes to international peace and stability and the promotion of such communications in the interests of the United States. And the law goes on to very specifically say that U.S. international broadcasting, under its broadcasting standards, must be consistent with the broad foreign policy objectives of the United States, and it must be conducted in accordance with the highest professional standards of broadcast journalism. And it needs to do 3 things. It needs to do news, this is quoting again from the Act, which is consistently reliable and authoritative, accurate, objective, and comprehensive. It must do a balanced and comprehensive projection of United States thought and institutions reflecting the diversity of United States culture and society. That's telling America's story. And it must do clear and effective presentation of the policies of the United States government and responsible discussion and opinion on those policies. That third point I always felt fit pretty comfortably in the first point, which is doing the news. Doing the news, part of it is saying this is what the policy of the United States government is. That's part of what news people do, and then responsible discussion of that policy. The tough question about, and I need to say that the independence of the journalists is protected by what I've already referred to, a firewall, which is in legislation, which says U.S. government officials, and in fact now including the management of U.S. International Broadcasting itself, the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, cannot dictate content and interfere in content creation. Full stop. It's a violation of the law if they do so. So that firewall protects the journalistic independence so the broadcasters can do their work without fear or favor. This doesn't mean they shouldn't interact with U.S. government officials. Certainly they should. They should do what journalists do. They should be having them on the air. They should be asking them tough questions, and they should be putting it out there. So to a point that Matt's written about so thoughtfully just in recent days even about whether or not this is propaganda, is U.S. international broadcasting propaganda or not? I have a very clear answer to that, which is yes and no. No, because it is not designed and intended to push a particular narrative in favor of the policies of any given administration or point of view of the United States government. That is not what it's meant to do, to push that and try to sell it to people. It is propaganda in the sense of the very fact of doing high-quality, independent, pluralistic journalism and rendering that in 62 languages around the world serves as an example of our society and the role of free speech, debate, and discussion in our society. So it is propaganda, if you will, on behalf of our system and of our set of values. When you hear this content in Farsi, when you hear it in Russian, you can draw conclusions that, you know what, I'm hearing critical points about the United States. I'm hearing a Taliban spokesperson in a carefully moderated context, not just given an open microphone, but ask tough questions about things that the Taliban has done. You can draw conclusions about the society from which this content comes. And the last thing I'll say by way of opening is just a tribute to the thousands of people who make this happen. The vast majority of these people are citizens of the countries from which they're reporting. They're doing so under increasingly hazardous conditions in which they operate. And if you look, for instance, at the website of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it will inform you that RFERL has been declared an undesirable organization by the Russian government just in recent weeks, which means if you're in Russia or Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine, and you're a Russian citizen or a stateless person, if you access content of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, if you like it, if you share it, if you comment on it, if you share it, or if you try to contact RFERL, you are subject to prosecution by the Russian government. And this is applied to other media outlets within Russia as well. And in particular, then I would note there are 4 Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty journalists who right now are in jail in Belarus, in occupied Ukraine, and in Russia because of the work that they've done. Andrei Kuznechuk, Igor Losik, Vladislav Yesipenko, and finally Alsu Kurmasheva. Scan me if you like. Scan me if you like. And I have flyers about Alsu, who is a journalist with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Tatar Bashkir service, who is a dual Russian-U.S. citizen and went to Russia in October because her mother had fallen ill in Kazan, and the Russians promptly said, glad to see you, you're in jail now because you haven't registered as a foreign agent, and the content of what you do is breaking Russian law about reporting on the war in Ukraine. Journalism is not a crime. These people need our support desperately, and anything you all can do to try to help Alsu by reaching out to your representatives and others to argue with the Russians on behalf of her and these terrific journalists is much appreciated. So I took more than my 10 minutes, which was to take away the time you guys didn't take, and I apologize for that, but I think that's all I've got.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Matt, quick historical question here. Jeff said he cringed at the phrase information warfare. It's a dirty word in the U.S., so is propaganda. And this goes right across the U.S. government. We heard from Nina, and this is a case in point. No one wants to be seen as coordinating information towards an end. And maybe that well, never mind. But, you know, the military has a conflict between informers versus influencers, and there's drastically fewer resources for the folks doing PSYOP, which is the influence side of things. In the State Department, they would probably also cringe at the idea that they're information warriors or something like that. So no one wants to be seen as doing this work, right? Why is that historically? You're deep in the history on this. Was there like a moment where it became what it is today, where it's sort of like in the shadows and we don't like to think about it? Or does this just bubble up naturally from our open liberal democratic system?
So this is a huge question that we could take up the entire rest of the time just to talk about examples. Let me start with what Jeff described to you about the U.S. international broadcasting. The reason why the United States decided to keep the radio broadcast service and its international information programs that it launched during World War II under the name U.S. Information Service, as well as the broadcaster, which was generally referred to as the shortwave broadcasting and sometimes referred to as Voice America or Voices of America, different names, was because there was a need to counter misinformation or counter disinformation, correct misinformation, and fill in the gaps in the absence of information. That's fundamental. That's why it existed, that's why it was kept, and that's why it continues to exist today. And at the time, this was sometimes referred to as propaganda, because at the historical view, if we go back to the time in the 1940s, particularly in the immediate post-war, well, even before the war was ended, so late 1944, 1945, you heard the word propaganda often, but it required a qualifier, good, bad, ours, theirs, something, because it was about the promotion of information, the sharing, propagating ideas, etc. Later on, that became a dirty word. Now, there's all arguments that even before World War II was a dirty word, but in this immediate post-war environment, the main lesson of Nazi propaganda was the elimination of alternative voices. Was not that the information merely existed, not that they were simply messengers, but that there were they eliminated the other voices, which is why the freedom of information was paramount. So for the U.S. experience, the Article 19 that Peter spoke about, this was integral. This was all part of why the U.S. wanted an international information sphere. In fact, there were discussions at the time to create we know of what a diplomatic passport is, but a press passport of the same caliber. That information, press information, would be able to freely move across borders. Reporters, journalists would be able to freely move across borders. They would have special press passports. That obviously did not come about. So moving around, we have this misunderstanding of how we use propaganda. So if you look back, you have things where the word propaganda is used, therefore it was propaganda. Well, it meant something different than it usually does today. In fact, to this point, where I have notes for a reason, now it's helpful if you can find them, whatever. I looked this up. Words like nice and silly, they have changed their meaning dramatically. They don't mean what they originally meant. Propaganda is almost that same thing. So in the framing and in our common use, we are right now propagandists. Why? Because we're trying to discuss a certain idea. We're trying to get you to understand something. By definition, it's propaganda. I was just reading a master's paper from somebody who is currently serving in the State Department in the public diplomacy area as he was writing his master's thesis, and he was outright declaring he's a propagandist. That's fine. Technically, yes. Is that a useful term? No. But I think part of this issue, ultimately, to wrap this up, so we can have other people talk, as I said, I could go on forever about this, is that the leadership has failed to understand the role of the informational element of policy. And so when the word propaganda gets tossed out, it somehow shuts down the conversation. So for example, if you look at law review articles about the Smith-Mundt Act, which was the fundamental law that enabled and authorized a vast amount of engagement by the State Department abroad, and including the State Department's ability to facilitate other agencies to work and engage abroad. It also allowed an informational component, Voice of America and other activities, and virtually anything at state informational abroad, or some, not all. If you look at law review articles, they just say it's propaganda, and they roll with it from there. They never define it, never clarify it, and they seem to explicitly, not just implicitly, rely on the derogative sense that's there. Now, everybody's going to influence. You're going to communicate to influence. I'm holding this microphone. So we have this bad relationship. So it does percolate into policy, and people just fear and they step back, I think, because we don't prioritize the informational element of policy as important.
Great, thank you for that. So I said, this goes right across government, but I don't really know that because, there's military tools, there's diplomacy, but there's also a third option. And it's hard to get information about it for all the right reasons. But Adam, can you speak to this? I sort of highlighted the military has this tension. The journalists don't, there's a tension there as well. Is there a similar current in the CIA, or is it, how does it go down there?
So it's interesting what you said about, Matt, about leadership and coordination and things like that. And the comment about covert action being the third option. So sometimes covert action is referred as that, and essentially that's where the leaders of this country, the president and the other elected leaders, have determined that political, or not political, but diplomatic and economic means and foreign policy are not working, so they're going to have this third option. To be very clear, though, covert action is in no way, any shape or form, a silver bullet. Covert action has to be an integral part of foreign policy. It has to be connected with it. It can't be a separate message. It can't be an alternative message. It has to be coordinated with what the overt foreign policy of the United States government is. And that goes into the whole idea when we think about national power and our place here in the world, that whole of government approach. If we look at the history of warfare, there were times where armies could take the battlefield, and when it came to logistics and how they operated, it was armies in uniform lining up against each other, doing battle, and that would decide the outcome of a conflict to varying degrees. We're in a world now with connectivity, where the internet, the interdependence of our economies, and everything that's also going on, the ability to travel around the world so quickly, that as we think about our role on this planet and how we interact with people and the role of democracy, that there has to be a whole of government approach. And that's where covert action, once it's decided and there's a presidential finding, that's when it can be put into play. Speaking about the intelligence community and the agency, with some of that tension maybe you mentioned. So the role of the CIA is to collect, analyze, report, and do covert action. Within the agency, there's different directorates, and you can look on the website and see these. The Directorate of Analysis, they're the ones analyzing the information that's collected, whether it's human, SIGINT, or other types of different sources out there. You have the Directorate of Operations, they're the ones going out there collecting this information. You have Director of Science and Technology, Director of Support. You have these different directorates. Within these directorates are different career paths that you can go up to. And in these different career paths, you can excel and reach the top. But as you find yourself rising in the ranks within the agency, depending on what directorate you're in, you have to understand this whole of government approach. Nothing can be conducted in isolation. Whether that's collection, analysis, using technology, or covert action, it all has to be interwoven and then applied to the rest of the foreign policy, whether that's connected with the State Department, the Department of Defense, Treasury, and everything that's going on there. There are some very highly trained, specialized, and focused individuals who work in this arena, and if all they want to do for the rest of their life is focus on that arena, they can. And they can do that, and they can focus on it, and that's what they're going to do. But other people will get exposure to different aspects of the intelligence world and the realm of national security, because that informs them to, when they rise to the ranks where they become someone who's advising a policymaker, that they're able to provide an informed perspective about that information. So getting back to the original question about is there a tension, I don't think there's a tension, at least from my experience, and I've worked with this all over the world. It is recognizing what tool is appropriate for that particular foreign policy objective, and then applying that accordingly. That's what I would say.
Thank you for that. So that sort of raises the question of coordination. And Jeff, you have experience in this space of the interagency process, coordinating sort of information from the perspective of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Could you share some experiences with that, how that goes down, successes and failures?
Well, I got to say, the first time I found myself in the White House Situation Room talking about complex issues around Russia, I had to say to myself, what the hell am I doing here as a career journalist? But it was seeing all sides of this. Frankly, and to a point that Matt has made, most of what I did in the interagency process was to raise awareness and visibility of U.S. international broadcasting across the U.S. government so that other parts of the U.S. government could understand the utility of U.S. broadcasting in advancing U.S. national security interests in ways that are entirely consistent with a journalistic mission. Let me give you an example. Afghanistan. The Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty have highly successful, big audience, huge credibility services in Dari and Pashto, so the main languages of Afghanistan, big audiences. When the U.S. was deeply militarily involved in Afghanistan, things happen. So my point would be, look, DOD, if you have mistakenly bombed a civilian wedding and killed a bunch of Afghan civilians, because unfortunately those kinds of things happen in a war space. We're journalists. We want to find out your perspective on why that happened and what you might have to say about it, because for sure the Taliban is going to be out with their version of that story in the next 10 minutes, and it's not going to make the United States look good. We're going to put you on the air, DOD folks, and we're going to ask you tough questions, and we're going to give you the opportunity to make your statements about what this happened, which is what journalists do as part of our balanced reporting on the incident. And you're going to reach very large audiences with your version of the story, with a balanced, objective approach to the story through our channels, that you're certainly not going to get your version of the story out through the Taliban's media outlet. So there'd be those kinds of interactions to more broadly make U.S. government aware of the sheer reach and extent to which U.S. international broadcasting was able to report, consistent with professional journalism, actions of the U.S. government when they go right as well as when they go wrong. So frankly, that was most of what I did. But also it was to be able to take back to the agency, again, on the high side of the firewall, not where the journalists are working, but on the side of the firewall that has integrated with the rest of the U.S. government. What are the priorities? So by law, U.S. international broadcasting has to go around to the rest of the U.S. government every year, the State Department, the intelligence community, the Treasury Department, whoever through the interagency process seems relevant, and say, what are your priorities? What's really important here? Oh, the Balkans. You're paying particular attention to the Balkans, so that when we then would think about what should we emphasize in perhaps standing up new language services, taking down language services that perhaps no longer are needed or effective, we have the information from the rest of the U.S. government about what we should consider to be the priorities. Again, not what to broadcast there, but what should be the priorities, and we then would reflect that in our budget submissions, including asking to open new language services and close services that had done their thing. On some specific occasions, we would ask for interagency support from other parts of the government for things we wanted to do. Again, still with respect for professional journalism. In 2010, 2010 or 11, was it, when the U.S. bombed Libya and Gaddafi was toppled as a NATO operation against Libya. There was a desperate need to get information in Arabic to people in Libya about what was happening. Well, the U.S. government has aircraft assets that are flying broadcast platforms. So we negotiated with the Department of Defense saying, we would like to use your platform to get high-quality FM radio into Libya from our service. These are our journalists doing what they're doing without fear or favor on a frequency. From our point of view, we had to make sure in the agreement with Defense that our frequency would be ours alone and would not be shared for use for PSYOPs or any other purpose that the military might have, but that we'd have a dedicated frequency to transmit. So we would seek and get and use the kind of assistance and cooperation for something very specific like that, but again, not in a way that gets in the way of the work that the journalists are doing, just to facilitate something like the distribution of their content.
So I want to jump in and add to something that Jeff said. And this goes into the education, so not just the interagency collaboration, but just the education and awareness of what this stuff is and why it is important, and where the term propaganda is really damaging. So you'll see news reports, you'll see analysis. I've mentioned some law review articles where the word propaganda is just tossed out there, and then that just sets a tone. So an example with what Jeff mentioned about Afghanistan and the bombing and using the radio, and another example I have from Afghanistan was the Taliban lit off a bomb that killed some women and children, and the NATO PAO was going to, ISAF PAO was going to release the press release saying this was not NATO, this was the Taliban. Well, the Taliban got the press release out first. Now the PAO said, I can't release my press release, it's not my job anymore. Why not? Because then he would be a counter-propagandist. It's not his job. So there we see there's just a fundamental dysfunction of understanding what is your role in this space, what is information, what is public opinion, and what is this thing propaganda. It is a really fascinating, and we can go on and on about this, of how these concepts of I can inform, I do not influence, it just magically pervade. So an example to speak to what Adam was talking about a bit is, maybe to make this a bit simpler, in the military world, and I know few people here are in the military world, but a combat commander will have a public affairs officer and likely a JAG, the lawyer, next to them. And the public affairs officer is going to generally say, I'm making generalizations, this is how this action will play in the United States, or this is how I can manage it with the media. The JAG is going to say, this is what's legally permissible based on the law of armed conflict. If the PSYOP, the psychological operations officer, who is the only one that's a trained communicator among that group, was there, the PSYOPer would probably say, well, what's our objective? Well, do we need to drop a bomb on that house to achieve that objective? Can we do it through other means? Which doesn't necessarily means using text and pictures. There are other ways to cause influence and change behavior. So the PSYOPer is going to have a very different perspective, but to the point is that the PSYOPer, because of the lack of education and training, is not there. Now move that into the standard civilian place, as Jeff was talking about the budget. The civilian influencer, to use a term, is not at the table. It's not part of the process. It's not inculcated that there is an informational element to this. How do we deal with the abstract policies? Well, that's how we deal with it, is abstractly, or on a macro scale. So anyway, I just wanted to add that PAO in Afghanistan, I'm not a propagandist. That is a place we seed, and we can see that same kind of mentality in the first panel that they are fighting against.
If I could add real quick and build off what Jeff and Matt have been saying here, using that Afghan example, I think the speed, responsiveness, and proaction is critical to some of the stuff we're talking to. But I want to say more than that. Now in a world of AI and deepfakes and everything else that's going on there, speed and coordination, I don't think we understand how to get there yet, because things are happening so fast. and so quickly that how are we going to respond? And then we have this institutional friction that slows things down and inhibits a potential response or a potential action that could have averted something. How do we do that? And referring back to the previous panel with what Tiffany Hugh was talking about with the puffer jacket, a lot of times that first message, whether right or wrong or gets corrected later or redacted or whatever it is or countered, that first image or first statement is what sticks in people's minds. And so as we think about information and how it's being communicated, speed and responsiveness are critical. But what do we do when we still want to have that, or still need to have that human governor on how we communicate things and ensure it's in line with our democratic values, which we're supporting?
And for me, sorry to jump in, that's a leadership issue, because this is my statement before, that an errant munition that explodes is much more okay than an errant message that explodes. So the classic example is a platoon can be patrolling in Iraq back then, and they could shoot a kid, but they couldn't put a flyer on a telephone pole saying a kid is missing, because the flyer was PSYOP, because it's paper. And that's just an odd way, that's a reality, and that's a leadership problem. That's not empowerment. It's a failure to empower. It's a failure to educate, failure to train, and failure to support, because mistakes will happen, and there's just no backing. And one thing to keep in mind is that this is an asymmetric issue. Everything that was in the first panel, the political warfare here, this is cheap and easy. It can be iterated multiple times. It can be through proxy or direct, and we want to be comfortable with traditional warfare. Well, our adversaries, we are so strong in traditional warfare, quote unquote, that why wouldn't our adversaries go through the other direction? In fact, it's inherent if you really look at Russian and Chinese history. This is the way you work. You don't have to go face on. And so this is where it's the war we've been engaged in, but yet it's the war we're failing to prepare for.
All right, I think we've done a good job of talking about the failures and the problems of what is. Now let's try to transition to maybe the what should be. And Adam said the magic word, proaction, proactive. It's been in the air a few times already in the conference. What does an effective or proactive information posture function look like in the U.S.? And I'll throw out a bunch of questions here, and feel free to take it an agency-specific route or go whole of government. Do we need to take lessons from our adversaries? What about our allies? How should it be organized? Do we need new agencies and authorities? And is there a specific U.S. leader or model from history that we should elevate? And then, if you could, what role do universities play in facilitating that more proactive stance? And yep, Scott, melee, go for it.
Yeah, so Peter, I want to ask you a question, if you can dial into me here for a sec. Are you with me?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Breaking down the pool.
That's okay. Come on up if you don't mind, because it gets to the questions that Kevin has just posed.
Yeah, so it's doubled now.
So I was citing the first words ever spoken on the Voice of America, which is, news may be good, the news may be bad, we're going to tell you the truth. For 20 years, I worked in U.S. international broadcasting, relying on the fundamental belief that in the long haul, truth will win. And I have one of Tom Kent's books right here, in which he quotes Thomas Jefferson, "Truth will do well enough if left to shift for herself. She has no need of force to procure entrance into the minds of men."
I didn't agree with it.
Well, in a way, that's my question, Tom, to Peter. You know, what about the truth as a winning formula? Can we stick with the concept of truth? And I'm asking on behalf now of U.S. International Broadcasting, which prides itself on telling the story straight. Can we stick with the idea that truth over the long haul is a winner in the information space, or are we in territory that's too complicated for that?
Well, let's unpack it. Well, here's the start of our unpacking. You know, there's truth plus there's the amplification. So let's unpack it. How is it going to achieve victory? What's our theory of change after having been, humiliated by so many USAID and State Department sort of like, documents. We need a theory of change. So how does truth get to victory?
Do you want to take that, or you want me to come back? So that if presented with the facts, with reality, people will make rational decisions about the way they wish to live their own lives and the way they wish to have a government and a society around them, and will move to make those kinds of societies in place. And those kinds of societies are much more compatible with our society and our values, even if we disagree on things, than those that operate in an authoritarian space.
But let's just take the first bit of that. That people, make rational choice acts decisions about information. I'm not the philosopher, but it's kind of rational choice theory, essentially. So I don't think there's much support to the idea that rational choice theory is victorious. In economics, we think that people don't make rational choices. There's been people who've been criticizing that sort of conceit for a very long time. Going all the way back to Walter Lippmann, sort of questioning it. So the idea, and since then we have all this research about confirmation bias, and this idea that there's a rational choice actor, going through some sort of mythical marketplace of ideas, weighing things, and then choosing the most high quality one. I think we're like the last, the people who hold on to this idea. I think in economics and psychology and everything else, nobody has found that to be true. Talking about truth.
I'm not sure. I'm glad I asked that question, but that's part of a way of trying to get to an answer about where do you go from here. U.S. international broadcasting is not going to explicitly do disinformation unless Congress changes the U.S. International Broadcasting Act and says it's the job of U.S. international broadcasting to do disinformation. In which case, I don't think I'd work there, but maybe somebody would, and that would be a ministry of the U.S. government. We'll see how that goes. So disinformation is not an answer going forward. So for the moment, you stick with high-quality, verifiable, fact-based information, with one of the biggest challenges being increasingly how do you actually get it to people, which is an old Cold War challenge that we're facing, again, increasingly today with actions by countries such as Russia.
I also don't think, does it have to be that, you've created a bit of a binary choice, which is the classic propagandistic trick to do. Give people a false choice and therefore win the argument. Yes and no, a propagandist. No, but it's not a choice between truth versus disinformation. It's like, it's how do you integrate truth into people's lives? My new book, it's all about somebody who used very, very elaborate ways to do it. But without getting there, look, we know some of the most effective ways of teaching people about medical issues, about HIV was through George Clooney and ER, So even if I completely agree that we need to stick with evidence, let's call it that, with evidence-based content, but how you get it is the question, really.
Yeah. And I think there's a role for what Jeff's talking about here, but Matt sort of brought up this idea of we're a lot of well-meaning amateurs against sort of hardened professionals that they do this for a living. They're not thinking about, Roman was talking about, they're not thinking about the ideas like this great marketplace, Socrates and the Agora, we're just having a chat. It's a battlefield. And so, there's a sense that we're just wading into this sort of, ongoing turret fire. So maybe journalism is aside, but what does proactive look like in terms of, is it a training thing? Is it an education thing? It seems like we're in a chicken-egg situation where leadership doesn't get it because there's no one at the table. There's no one at the table because there's no resources to get the people at a higher enough level to get at the table. Does that make sense? So how do we get, what are some ideas to get beyond this?
So just on Jeff keeps bringing up U.S. international broadcasting, and I just want to make sure we understand that where USAGM's networks operate, is that still up? No, good. Are those places, my shorthand for where those places, where its target markets are the places Special Operations Command has been, will be, or recently was. So this is not what he's talking about is not journalism that is intended to engage in the UK, in France. So this is a discrete tool. And I think that's a really important value, and that's why he mentioned that many of its journalists are from these dangerous places, because that's inherently where that operation is functioning. So we broaden that. So that's just a small tool for a specific set of geographic areas or conceptual areas, right? Languages do not end at physical borders, right? So that's one thing. So to this broader question, the resources reflect priorities. The priorities reflect the understanding of the importance by leaders. And I think a solution, there's no one solution here, is that universities like this start to integrate into the poli-sci, into the international relations, the idea that public opinion, actually does matter in the conduct of foreign policy. And I think it's probably in the domestic policy discussions of how that works. I don't know. I'm a foreign policy specialist. And that's essential. But it also means that you have these deeper conversations with your neighbor of what is foreign policy. Why does it matter to us? Why does it matter what somebody abroad thinks? Why does it matter that we need to counter the disinformation abroad? Now, how that takes place, that's a separate conversation. We have to understand why it's important. Then we can get into the details, and we can start to iterate and change and see what works and what doesn't. So I get asked, what about a recreation of USIA? Well, USIA was an example of leadership dysfunction. It was breaking a larger model of deep integration across the interagency with foreign policy, shrinking it and moving it outside. So if you're thinking about recreating USIA, you don't know you don't know your history. But ultimately, it depends on what the president wants, and what his cabinet wants, and what his national security staff are going to support. And so how do we get there? I think it's in a way, it's a psyop. We need to communicate and influence and ground up, and hopefully the top will start to get it as well through the activity. It's plain and simple as that.
So thinking about it from my time in the military, one thing we used to always talk about was that every private lieutenant, everybody out there in the field was a form of a censor. They were out there no matter what grade they were, no matter what rank, they were receiving information, that it was their responsibility to make sure they communicated that back up the chain, which is very different from when we think of World War I, where the private was a bullet catcher, and that's what they were doing as they were going over the wall. So why are our military men and women, our service members today, why are they censors? They're more educated, they're more aware, they're more in tune to what's going on. So if we think about that as them being censors and receiving information, they can also be elements for communication. Napoleon coined the term the strategic corporal, and how a corporal can change the tide of a battle. But even in today, from personal experience, whether it was in Iraq or Afghanistan, you had very relatively low rank individuals who were out there in the field who would make decisions that could have theater-wide effects. And so as we think about the military population today, one thing we should continue doing is educating, which is a lot of what we're talking about up here, educating to what this is. This is another element of power when we talk about information. It's no longer just a rocket, it's no longer a bullet or a rifle or an individual, a ship or a tank or a ship. Information is a part of this, and we have to educate that force that they are an integral part of that grand strategy.
The historical side. So I'm glad you didn't mention it, but you implicitly referred to it, and so this is not a critique, but Adam just mentioned about the informational piece, right? There's that DIME construct. D-I-M-E, D for diplomacy, I for information, M for military, E for economic, which was since perverted to include finance, intelligence, and law enforcement, which just reflects my criticism that I'm about to make about the DIME model, which is it's a model of bureaucracy, not actually levers of power, or means of power, or elements of power. It's a bureaucratic model. And going back to World War I, what's really interesting is that the U.S. Army War College in 1917 came up with a 4-part model of the elements of power. Political, not diplomatic, which is focused on the State Department, but political power, because today DoD exercises a tremendous amount of political power. Just for example, C for combat power, right? Because the military, it's what we think of the military is really its combat effectiveness and in the perception of the combat effectiveness, which is really important because both the P or the D, depending on how you want to look at it, P is better, and the C, the combat power, rely on the informational element. Otherwise, it's covert action, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't have the same dissuasive, persuasive effect. And the I is not this innocuous information. In 1917, the Army War College model was P for psychologic. Not psychological. I don't understand that. I haven't been able to determine why psychologic versus psychological. But it's the effect of that lowercase information, right? It's what is the effect? Because you could have combat power have a psychological effect. You can have political actions that have a psychological effect. In fact, the Army's Military Intelligence Bureau organized around this, there was also the E, economic. That hasn't changed. That's still a catch-all of all sorts of stuff, including aid and commerce. And they actually arranged the Military Intelligence Bureau of the Army around this PPCE model. We've lost these things. There's so many things we can draw from history that we've forgotten. But again, I just caution, my personal caution is information is ammunition, and it's easy shorthand, but let's not get lost in the munition. It's the effect of that munition that we need to be paying attention to.
Great. Does anyone want a final word on this before we turn over to the audience?
So the difference between, you let me in and chaos.
Cryptid,
but the difference is, I completely agree with Matt. So the British in World War II had the Political Warfare Executive, which was created after much turbulence for this exactly, to bring together the different tools of political warfare, which I think is a great term that we probably can't use, but let's use it while we haven't thought of a better one. The big difference now is that so many capabilities lie outside of government and are much better. And I know it's such a cliche to say it's all about networks now, but the political warfare of the future will be won by the team with the best, who can leverage networks better. So we know the other side's networks. It's troll farms and mercenaries and corrupt media owners in the Western Balkans and a bit of state Russian media, all working together, sometimes very effectively, sometimes not, but invested into. Our networks are just starting to emerge. It's white hat hackers who have a talent for getting all sorts of interesting things on the dark net. It is incredible investigators like Christo Grozev. It is elves as opposed to their trolls who are, I think, spreading truth, but who are understanding the reality of operating in the cyber arena. And maybe, we can get into lots of details because I actually think it's emerging during the invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's going to be that. They know their networks, and we've spent so much time analyzing theirs. We can start breaking their networks much more aggressively, by the way. Don't see why we're not doing that. But we need to start developing ours, which are going to be different. They are going to subscribe to a different set of values. But maybe unlike an RFE, they are going to be effects-driven. They're going to start with, what's the aim? Getting them out of Niger, because they've just pushed us out of Niger. How are we going to do that? Literally yesterday.
All right. Anyone in the audience want to throw one up? Right here in the front.
Okay. Well, there's so many things. I think that, Jeff and Matt both know that I have a little bit too much experience with the public diplomacy side of this conversation. But I think one of the things that we're not talking about here, because we're really talking about our overt efforts. I think this conversation has been about public diplomacy, about the spending in the international affairs budget. It's so much about our culture of how we do this, because we can talk about leadership, we can talk about priorities. I think, the State Department thinks it's prioritizing this because there's a budget line item for it, for exchanges. And they think that they're creating a network of people who love us because we pay for their education, or we pay for a 3-week exchange program. But our policies are really the thing. Like they can love us because we put them on a Fulbright scholarship, and the second we start doing what's happening in Gaza, they'll turn on us because our policies are our policies. And I just think that we have this culture. It's really confusing because on the one hand we have this AGM, right? Which is like we have these information channels that we want to communicate in these foreign publics. At the same time, though, we're like, it's icky if we give them this message. But then at the same time, Congress is like, but AGM, you cannot have that person. Don't go interviewing the leader of the Taliban, or don't go interview this person who's extremely newsworthy because it'll look like we're supporting them. We have this strange, schizophrenia in what we're doing, but at the same time, we won't allow ourselves, because of, I think, our culture of we need to be very honest about what we're comfortable with. I'll just end with, when China kicked us out completely of having American spaces, we were perfectly happy with them to have Confucius Institutes all over until there was hard evidence that there was spying, and then it was like, close up shop, get them out. But the idea was not a reciprocity. When you talk to the State Department, it was once they see our open society, that's what they'll choose. So there's this naivete in here as well. So I'm completely all over the place. Have at it.
So I see that, spot on, and I can expand on that with that reciprocity issue. And this goes to a point that Jess Dawson made in the first panel about RT in the U.S. I was trying to further the negotiation when I went to Beijing and Shanghai about, they promised us, when I was part of BBG, that we could open a second bureau in Shanghai. The VOA could have a bureau in Shanghai, a second bureau. And then they were like, no, but the reciprocity. And they had put in place significant limits on VOA's operations and staff levels. And yet, at the same time, Radio China International had leased 24/7 a radio station here in Texas, not to mention CCTV and all these other Chinese outlets, government outlets over here. And the U.S. government, did almost nothing. In fact, in my tracking at that time, Michelle Obama, then First Lady, had made 2 requests for reciprocity, and the President had made 1 request for reciprocity, and that was it. But for the State Department, yeah, I concur. You were inside. You are also a viewer on the outside. The State Department, I think the culture that you are primarily speaking to is a bureaucratic culture, and the defective State Department culture, that again, this informational element is something over here. And it's not deeply integrated. So you don't have the President pushing, you don't have the Secretary of State pushing, and a representation of that is the fact that the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy is a position that's been vacant nearly 50% of the time since it was created in 1991 as the successor to the Director of USIA. In fact, the best analysis comparing the hiring, I've written about the vacancies. I think the best analysis looking at the comparative gaps and the qualifications of USIA directors to undersecretaries for public diplomacy comes from a Russian scholar that was a researcher at IMIMO, thank you. She sent me an English translation 2 years ago, and it was terrific. And we just don't care. The conversation. So when we have these conversations about how do we improve these things, we're not even looking at considering that there's a Chief International Information Engagement Officer at the State Department, an undersecretary. It's completely ignored because all of this stuff is broken because of the lack of leadership to prioritize, hold accountable, to make them do something, and to put them at the table. And it's allowed to operate that way. And again, it's a leadership issue, so it's not a schoolhouse issue. Army War College eliminated their information operations faculty a while ago. You have the big Army and Pentagon in general eliminating PSYOP because they want to focus on just great war, big war type of stuff. And so it's permeated across the government, and there's just I disagree that it's necessarily the American culture. I think it's our political culture and our lack of understanding that and refusal to accept over decades. This is not a recent issue. This is a decades-old process, going back even, I think, to the 60s, where it's the militarization of policy and it's just guns and bombs that decides our national security.
Yeah, and the schizophrenia, I mean, that's a loaded term, but maybe it's apt, is interesting because at the same time that the military is doing that, they also opened or stood up in the 2019 NDAA, a Foreign Malign Influence Center, which got some press. And so on the one hand, we're getting rid of capabilities, but then there's also, we need this. And so State Department has GEC, but it's embattled. We had the disinformation board, governance board, thank you, that Nina was on. So it's like we're doing it, we're not doing it, we're not doing it, we're doing it kind of thing. So it's and it seems like when this sort of dynamic plays out, it seems like it is the military that ends up, holding the buck, and so to speak. So that speaks to the militarization policy, which is a whole nother issue. But we have time for maybe one or two more questions, and if you guys don't have one, I still have some. Right in the front here.
Okay, so propaganda I think of as an umbrella term. It's a bit of a loaded term because it's got some historical problems with it going back to Nazi Germany and before. But the word propaganda is using information to influence people. It's not meant to be objective. You're trying to get them to do something. But there are different kinds of propaganda, right? There is, these are old-fashioned terms, but there's white propaganda where you are telling the truth and where you believe that it's true. Then there's black propaganda, disinformation, where it's false information that is false information. So, to a certain extent, maybe part of why people have been backing off and getting allergic to this idea about the mission of spreading true information to influence people is because of the word propaganda, because it has that bad smell to it. But the idea of using true information to counter false information, where's the problem with that? Again, it's selective. It's meant to be influential. It's not objective. You're not saying everything. But when somebody's saying something false and you counter it with something true, technically speaking, that's propaganda. You're trying to influence them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
Well, one a bit of a historical aside. So, as you quite rightly pointed out, the propaganda fide, to propagate the faith, was the first time the term is used to propagate the Catholic faith. And one interpretation about the negative smell to the word propaganda is to do with the fact that in Protestant countries, anything to do with Catholic distribution of information was going to be negative. So actually, our negative sense of that term is deeply kind of connected to the Protestant skepticism of anything that comes from the Pope in Rome. And listening to this one, damn right. No, sorry, that's a bad cheap shot.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that about the Protestant Catholic, but also the bad smell. There's an author, Doob, D-O-O-B, who wrote about how propaganda in the U.S. has a bad odor, the word. But propaganda is probably, so I heard a long time ago that the lathe was the only machine that could make itself. I don't know if it's true, but I had heard that. Propaganda is, I think, the only word in the English language that to use it may be an act of it. And I think, and this is the heart of my criticism about the word propaganda, is that people are often too lazy and just call it propaganda. They may be well-meaning in thinking this is an innocent term because, look, if I look at the definition and the actual historical definition, it's neutral, and you must have a qualifier, good, bad, black, white, whatever it's going to be, ours, theirs, and ours is implicitly good, theirs is implicitly bad. That's not the popular use, especially today. And you will too often see discussions around these topics where the word propaganda is thrown out. And I think it's either lazy or it's an act of propaganda. Because the reality is, and as you put it, is that this conversation is an act of propaganda, right? Because we're trying to influence. Ergo. So an example I've had for the public affairs officers in the military is you're a PAO of a major U.S. base. There's going to be construction at the main gate, so traffic's going to have to get rerouted. So you're going to coordinate with the local populace, the local city. So how do we reroute traffic? What alternatives do we have and all that stuff? So not only is that public affairs officer is going to do that to keep good relations with the community. right? Because military base wants to maintain relations. They're a propagandist. They're a psychological operations officer. Why? Because they're influencing not only perceptions of the local community, but actually affecting their behavior. So where do the words matter? And so, again, I think propaganda, the real problem with it is we are simply too lazy. Too many people are too lazy in tossing out that term. And it's often an act of the word, and it short circuits the conversation about these important topics that we're talking about.
Food for thought. And speaking of food, it's lunchtime. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Oh, it's not?
That was propaganda.
Yeah.
That was disinformation.
Cut the feed. Okay, yes, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.